Hannah Calloway did not lower her eyes when the laughter came down off the corral fence, though every one of the 200 people on it knew exactly whose widow she was. She stood in the churned dust of Cyrus Dunmore's shipping pens, 90 days from losing her 40 acres over a $300 note, while the richest man in the county told the crowd that the black stallion behind him had put 2 grown men in splints in 6 weeks. Then, Dunmore bet 640 acres of the Cottonwood Bench that no woman alive could sit that horse. And he looked straight at her when he said it. If stories like this one are your kind of country, take one quiet second to subscribe and ride along. Because what happened in that corral over the next 15 minutes, and what it cost a proud man over the one hard season that followed, is the kind of story a town tells for 50 years. The day had started smaller than that, the way most ruinous days do. It was the 3rd Saturday of June in the year 1889 in the town of Larkspur, Montana Territory, and Hannah had walked the 4 miles in from the creek place because her wagon had a cracked felloe she could not yet afford to have set. She had gone first to the Merchant's Bank, where Aldous Finch kept the coolest room in town and the warmest manner in the territory, and he had smiled at her across the polished counter the way men smile at a thing already decided, and slid the paper across to her with 2 fingers, as if it might soil him. $300, principal and interest, due the 15th of September. 90 days. The note her husband had signed for breeding stock 2 springs back, when the future still looked like something a man could plant and water. You understand, Mrs. Calloway, Finch had said, the bank has carried this obligation longer than practice allows, out of respect for your late husband. My late husband paid this bank $1,100 in 4 years, Hannah said. I understand what the bank carried. She folded the notice into her apron pocket and walked out into the heat, and she did not let her hand shake until the door was shut behind her. That was a rule she had. Tom used to say that a horse reads your hands before it reads your face, and that a town is no different, only meaner, and in the 2 years since the fever took him in 3 days, a big, laughing, gentle-handed man of 36, sweated down to nothing between a Tuesday and a Friday, Hannah Calloway had given Larkspur nothing to read, not at the funeral, where the women of the sewing circle had studied her dry eyes and decided among themselves that she was cold. Not at the estate auction that fall, when the bank's men had sold Tom's saddle stock off the place to cover his paper, and half the county had come to bid on a dead man's dream at 10 cents on the dollar. Not once in the 700 days since, while she held 40 acres and a garden and 6 hard-broke workhorses together with her own 2 hands, took in other men's washing and other men's colts, and heard herself called the widow Calloway in the tone men use for a wagon with a broken axle. Something in the road. Something you go around. She was 32 years old that summer. She was not a large woman, and her dress had been blue once, the deep prairie blue of chicory bloom, and had faded to the color of noon sky, and she wore a work apron over it that carried the stains of every job in the county nobody else wanted. What Larkspur saw, when it bothered to see her at all, was a small, quiet, used-up woman walking on the shady side of the street, with her chin level and her mouth still. What Larkspur did not see, what it had never once thought to ask, was that Hannah Calloway had grown up the daughter of a Tennessee horse trader, had handled greenstock since she was tall enough to hold a lead rope, and had spent 9 years married to the best hand with a young horse in the territory, working beside him every day of it, in the round corral he built her as a wedding present. The county had decided what she was worth the day they buried Tom. It had not troubled to look again. The crowd was already 3 deep at Dunmore's shipping pens when she came past on her way to the feed store, and she would have kept walking, except that she heard the horse before she saw him. A scream, Not a whinny, a scream, high and furious and ragged at the edges, and then the boom of a body hitting planked rails hard enough to shake dust off the top pole, and a sound out of 200 throats that was half gasp and half cheer. Hannah stopped. She knew that scream the way you know a voice through a wall. She told herself she didn't. She went to the fence anyway, and found a gap between a drummer in a checked coat and old Webb Coulter, who was leaning on the crutch he'd used since April, his right hip ruined, his face gray and set like a man watching his own accident happen to somebody else, over and over. Inside the big pen, alone, stood the black stallion the whole county had been talking about since spring. 16 hands of him, maybe better, black as a stove lid from nose to hoof, no white on him anywhere, ribs showing faint under a coat gone dull with worry, hide scarred at the flanks, eye rimmed white, hindquarters bunched into the far corner while he faced the men on the fence the way a treed cat faces dogs. 2 ropes hung off him, one from the neck, one dragging from a hind foot, and a snubbing post in the center of the pen had been splintered off at the top like a matchstick. Dunmore had bought him unbroke off a horse drive the autumn before last, so the story ran, and every hand on the D-bar had taken his turn at him, and the horse had gotten worse with each one, and in April he had thrown Webb Coulter into the corral rails and shattered his hip. And 3 weeks ago, he had come over backward on young Denny Marsh and crushed his left arm so it would never again be much more than a hook to hang a bucket on. 2 riders, 2 stretchers. The Larkspur Register had taken to calling him the man-killer, which was not yet true, and printing that Dunmore ought to shoot him, which was likely. Cyrus Dunmore stood inside the fence with his boot on the bottom rail, out of range, and known to be out of range. A wide, red-faced, big-voiced man of about 55, who owned 6,000 deeded acres, grazed 10 times that in free grass, ran 4,000 head of cattle and 200 horses, held paper on half the businesses on Main Street, and had never in his life been made to feel small in public. He was enjoying himself. He had a crowd. He had a devil in a pen. And he had just watched the horse pile the last man in the county willing to try him. A contract buster out of Miles City who had asked $20, lasted neither of the 2 jumps he had been paid to survive, and left in the bed of a wagon, awake but not saying much. $40 I paid for him, Dunmore was telling the crowd, in the voice he used for telling things to crowds. $40, and he has cost me 2 riders, a buster, 3 saddles, and a snubbing post, and I will tell you all freely, I have had cheaper wolves. Laughter, the easy kind, the kind a rich man can raise just by pausing. Doc Ellison says shoot him. My foreman says shoot him. My wife, who never agreed with my foreman on any earthly subject, says shoot him. More laughter. Rafe Kittle, the foreman, leaned on the gatepost coiling a rope and smiling a thin smile at the dirt. He was a long, sallow, careful, moving man who never raised his voice, and Hannah had once watched him beat a balky mule off its feet at the livery scale and had crossed the street to keep from being near him ever since. It was Webb Coulter, of all people, leaning on his crutch beside her, who said it. Not to the crowd, to himself, the way Payne talks. Ain't a mean horse, he said quiet. I've rode mean horses. That's a horse somebody learned to be afraid, and then went on teaching him after the lesson took. He looked down and saw who was standing next to him and touched his hat brim, embarrassed. Mrs. Calloway, Mrs. Coulter, Hannah said. And then, because the horse had turned along the far rail just then, moving that big floating trot with his tail flagged and his nose flung high, and because she saw, under the fury and the ruin and the dull coat, the reach of the shoulder, and the way he set that near hind foot, and the particular high carriage of a head she had rubbed dry with feed sacks the January night he was foaled on her own kitchen-lit straw. Hannah Calloway said the first reckless thing she had said aloud in 2 years. She did not plan it. It came out of her the way a name comes out of you when you see a face across a train platform. "That horse isn't afraid of men," she said. "He's afraid of what's in their hands." She said it low, to Webb Coulter. But the drummer in the check coat heard it and repeated it, laughing, and it went along the fence like fire in cut grass and reached Cyrus Dunmore inside of 30 seconds with her name attached, the way everything in Larkspur reached everything else. And Dunmore, who had a crowd and a devil in a pen and a morning that needed a finish, turned around and found the widow Calloway at his fence and grinned the way a man grins when Providence hands him his entertainment. "Well," he said, loud enough for the street. "The widow's an authority." The crowd turned with him. All of it. 200 faces swinging onto her at once like weather vanes in a shifted wind. Hannah felt the heat come up her neck and kept her hand still on the rail. "I'd know that horse," she said. "That's all I meant by it." Oh, she'd know the horse. Dunmore came along the fence toward her, playing to both sides of himself. "Boys, you hear that? 2 riders in splints, a $20 buster hauled off in a wagon not an hour ago, and here's the answer to it. Been doing our washing the whole time." The laughter rolled again, bigger now, because it had a target with a face. Somewhere behind her a woman said, distinctly, "Poor thing," in the tone that means the opposite. "Tell you what, Mrs. Calloway, you come on in this pen and show us. I'll hold your bonnet." "I didn't come to town to ride your horse, Mr. Dunmore," Hannah said. "I came to buy seed corn." "No, ma'am, you came to tell better men their business." He wasn't grinning quite so wide now. Something about the level way she looked at him was spoiling his fun faster than he could sweeten it, and a rich man in front of a crowd will forgive you anything except that. "Here's what I'll do, and everybody on this fence is a witness to it. Everybody." He raised his voice like a man at an auction. "That black devil has beat every rider in this county. Buster from Miles City says he can't be rode. My foreman, who's forgot more about rough stock than this whole town ever knew, says he can't be rode. So it's a safe enough thing I'm offering. If the widow Calloway there can ride that stallion, ride him, mind, both feet up, around this pen and back to the gate, and walk away from it on her own legs, I will deed her the Cottonwood Bench. All 640 acres of it, the spring included. Filed at the courthouse, done and legal." He let the numbers sit on the crowd, and the crowd made the sound he wanted it to make. 640 acres of the best watered bench in the county, against a woman's neck. It was the kind of magnificence that costs nothing, and he was famous for it. And when she don't, Dunmore went on, softer, sweeter, leaning his forearms on the rail so that only the nearest 50 people could hear him being kind. "Why, we'll pass the hat for the doctor. Same as we done for better folks than her." Hannah looked past him at the horse. The stallion had stopped his circling and stood in the far corner, blown, sides heaving, that white-rimmed eye fixed on the men at the fence, and the 2 ropes hanging off him like snakes he'd given up trying to outrun. $15 of seed corn, she thought. 90 days. $300. 40 acres. A woman does sums fast when the whole street is laughing at her. It is amazing how fast. But it wasn't the sums that decided it, and she never afterward pretended it was. It was the head. The high, particular, unmistakable carriage of that black head, and the little crescent scar in front of the left ear, the size and shape of a woman's thumbnail. Where a weanling colt had once torn himself on a nail in a chicken coop door and bled down his cheek while her husband held him, and she sewed him up by lantern light with silk thread from her wedding dress box. She knew that scar. She had put it back together. "Write it down," Hannah said. The fence went quiet in patches, the way a fence does, near one's first. Dunmore straightened up off the rail. "What's that?" "Write it down and sign it, and I'll ride your horse." She heard her own voice come out flat and clear, the voice she used on green colts and drunk men, and she watched it land on him. 640 acres, the Cottonwood Bench, boundaries as filed, deeded free and clear if I ride that stallion around this pen and back to the gate. Put your name on it before witnesses. And I'll put up my 40 on Larkspur Creek against it, so it's a wager and not a gift. You've got 200 witnesses standing here, Mr. Dunmore. It ought to hold. For a long moment, it could have gone either way, and she knew it. He could laugh, refuse to dignify it, turn it into one more joke about the washing, and the crowd would follow him. The crowd always followed him. But she had said my 40 against it, and she had said before witnesses, and a bet is a sacred thing in a stock town, more sacred than the church and nearly as sacred as the brand. Refusing a wager he had offered himself, with the numbers already out of his own mouth, that would cost him something in front of this fence. And Cyrus Dunmore had never yet paid for anything in the coin of his own bigness. Besides, she saw him do his own sums. Her 40 acres, the creek frontage, folded into his east line. The banknote everybody knew about. The horse that could not be ridden. It was found money. It was charity with a show attached. Orrin. He bellowed, delighted. And Orrin Pruitt, the storekeeper, came elbowing along the fence, and butcher paper was sent for, and a pen, and right there on the top rail of the shipping pen, with the crowd craning and calling the spelling of her name to each other like it was a spell down, the wager was drawn out in Pruitt's careful ledger hand. If Hannah Calloway shall ride the black stallion, known as the D-Bar Man-Killer, mounted and unassisted, around the big shipping pen and back to the gate, and dismount on her own legs, Cyrus Dunmore binds himself to deed to her the section called the Cottonwood Bench, 640 acres with the spring, free and clear. Should she fail or decline, she binds herself to deed to Cyrus Dunmore her 40 acres on Larkspur Creek, subject to its existing note. Signed, C. Dunmore, signed, Hannah Calloway, in a hand steadier than the storekeeper's. Witnessed, and here the crowd surged, because everybody wanted on the paper. Witnessed by 12 men whose names filled the bottom margin and ran up the side. Orrin Pruitt, Webb Coulter, Doc Ellison, Sheriff Dan Hobb among them, the sheriff riding slow and saying to Dunmore as he did it, half joking and not sigh, "You're certain about this?" And Dunmore answering in the voice that carried to the street, "Dan, I have never been more entertained in my life." "Tomorrow morning," Hannah said, folding her copy into her apron pocket next to the bank notice, so that the two papers that would decide her whole life lay pressed together against each other like pages of one book. 10 o'clock. Tonight that horse stays in this pen alone. Both those ropes come off him. Nobody handles him, nobody waters him but the same man at the same hour, and nobody. She looked for the first time directly at Rafe Kittle, and something passed between them that the crowd missed and the horse would have understood. Nobody carries anything into that pen. If I find a mark on him in the morning that isn't on him now, the bet's off and the town will know why. Dunmore laughed and spread his hands. "Ma'am, you can read him poetry for all it'll change. 10 o'clock. Wear something you can be carried in." She walked the 4 miles home with the seed corn she had come for, because a woman who has just bet her homestead on a horse still has to plant. The prairie was going gold at the edges already, the false gold of a drought year, grass curing in June that should have cured in August. And she walked through the long light doing the one thing she had promised herself at the fence she would not do, which was remember. Diamond. Tom had named him the night he was foaled, the coldest January in 10 years. The black colt steaming on the straw of their kitchen side shed, because the barn was too far and the mare too weak. The mare was Dulcie, Dust, Tom called her, a plain dun with a head like a nail keg, and the kindest eye God ever put in a horse, and she had died before morning, and the black colt had lived because Hannah sat up 11 nights, feeding him cow's milk and molasses off her fingers. And Tom, punchy with no sleep, holding the colt's head in his big hands by the stove-light, had laughed and said, "Look at him. Coal black and shaking, out of a $10 Dunmore, and I'm telling you, he's the finest thing this outfit will ever raise." And when she had said something wifely about coal, and $10 mares, and men who don't sleep, Tom had said the thing he was always saying, the thing he half believed and she had come, over 9 years to believe entirely. Coal and diamond are the same stuff. Hannah, same exact stuff. The difference is what they've been through, and whether anybody troubles to look. So the colt was diamond, out of dust, and for 3 years he was the pride of 40 acres, halter broke at her hip, gentle to saddle at 3 in Tom's round corral, without a single buck jump, because Tom Calloway did not break horses, he made them. Slow, with his hands quiet and his voice low, and the braided rawhide hackamore he had plaited that first winter. And no bit, no spur, and no whip on the place. The colt would leave a feed bucket to follow her. He would come across the pasture to Tom's whistle, the low 3 notes, like the first bar of an old hymn slowed down. He was rising 4, just coming into himself, 16 hands of black promise, when the fever took Tom between a Tuesday and a Friday, and in October the bank's men came out with the appraiser. And the saddle stock went under the auctioneer's gavel in her own yard, and Cyrus Dunmore, who had heard what the Calloway outfit's young horses went for at Cheyenne, bought the green broke black stallion for $40 because nobody bid against the D-bar, and his men could not catch him for an hour, and when they had him roped and thrown and choked down in front of her. A colt that had never once in his life been roped, Hannah had stood on her porch with her nails cutting her palms and given the county nothing to read at all. She had not seen him since. 2 years. Whatever had been done to him in those 2 years had turned the horse that followed a whistle into a thing the newspaper wanted shot, and tomorrow at 10 o'clock. In front of the same crowd that had laughed at Tom's widow, she was going to walk into a pen with what was left of him and bet both their lives on what Tom Calloway had built into that colt before either of them was ruined. She did not expect to sleep. She lit the lamp instead and took the hackamore down off its peg by the door, where it had hung for 2 years like something between a tool and a headstone, and she was working the stiffness out of the rawhide with tallow and her 2 thumbs when she heard a horse turn in off the road, and a heavy, unhurried tread on the porch boards, and Caleb Wade's voice through the screen, pitched low so as not to startle her, the way he did everything. "Mrs. Calloway, it's Wade. Saw your light." Caleb Wade was the farrier at Larkspur, a wide-shouldered, deliberate man of about 38 who had come up from Colorado 6 years back with a wagon forge, an anvil named for his grandmother, and a way of standing under a kicking horse's belly as if it were a church pew. He talked the way he shod, no wasted motion. Long silences, while he decided if the next word was load-bearing. He had shod Tom Calloway's horses for 4 years, and never once, in the 2 years since the funeral, had he charged Hannah full price or let her catch him at it. She had noticed. She had filed it in the drawer, where she kept things she could not afford to think about. She let him in and poured him coffee she could not spare, and he sat with his hat on his knee and looked at the hackamore on the table for a while. "Heard about the bet," he said finally. "I expect Butte's heard about the bet." He turned the coffee cup a quarter turn. "I shod at the D-bar through March. Quit in April." He said it like a man laying 2 facts side by side on a bench, for her to pick up or not. She picked them up, after Webb Coulter's hip, before Denny Marsh's arm. Caleb looked up at her then, and his eyes were slow and steady and very hard. "I'll tell you what I saw, because you're going in a pen with him tomorrow, and it's yours to know. That horse never once offered to hurt a man that stood still. What he fights is what comes at him. And what came at him all winter was Rafe Kittle with a spade bit, a running iron for a persuader, and a quirt he loaded himself. Braided a strip of window screen wire into the fall of it. I watched him cut a horse's shoulder open with it like you'd open a feed sack, and I told Dunmore. And Dunmore said he don't tell a man like Kittle how to break rough stock. Results is what he pays for. So I pulled my nails, and I quit. He turned the cup back the quarter turn, as if putting the world back level. Marks are under the mane, mostly offside, where the judges don't look. Hannah sat still for a moment, with her hands flat on the table, and the lamp hissed, and something old and cold settled in her, right where it fit. He is not afraid of men. He is afraid of what is in their hands. Why'd Kittle do it that way? She asked. There's no sense in it. Ruin your own boss's stock. Because the horse shamed him, Caleb said simply. First week. Piled him in front of the crew, twice, and Kittle ain't been piled since he was a button. Some men, you shame them once, they'll spend money and years. They ain't breaking the horse. They're getting even with it. He stood and picked up his hat and stopped at the door with his hand on the frame and studied the porch boards. 10 o'clock, he said. I'd be obliged if you'd let me be at the gate. Not in the pen. At it. Why, Mr. Wade? Somebody's got to hand you the hackamore, he said, and went down the steps into the dark, and she heard his horse take the road at an easy trot, unhurried, like its owner. And she stood in the doorway a while, listening to it fade, and then she went in and slept 4 hours, which was 4 more than Cyrus Dunmore would have bet on. By 9:30 the next morning, there were more people at the shipping pens than had come to the hanging in '85. They stood 4 deep at the rails, and boys sat the top plank shoulder to shoulder, like swallows on a wire. And the Larkspur register man had his collar turned up in the heat and his notebook out. And Aldous Finch had shut the bank, on a Saturday following Monday. Shut. And the sewing circle was there under parasols, and Webb Coulter had been given a nail keg to sit on by somebody who wanted his crutch in the photograph, if there was going to be a photograph. Dunmore rode in at 9:45 on a tall gray, with silver conchos down the cheekpieces, dressed like Saturday and Sunday both, because whichever way the morning went it was his show. Rafe Kittle sat the fence by the gate with his rope coiled just so, and his loaded quirt hanging off his wrist by its braided fall, in plain sight, like a watch chain, like a thing he wanted her to see him wearing. Hannah came on foot, in the faded blue dress and the work apron, carrying nothing but the hackamore and a cotton lead rope, and the crowd's noise when she came around the scale house was a thing she felt on her skin rather than heard. Half cheer, half carnival, and under it, in the voices of women she had returned laundry to on Thursdays. A low, delicious hum of pity already rehearsing itself. Ellen Pruitt was taking 2-bit bets against her, under a parasol, at odds of 12-1. Nobody was taking the other end but Webb Coulter. And quietly, with the whole of the shoeing money in his cash box, Caleb Wade. The Stallion stood in the middle of the big pen. They had taken the ropes off him as she had required, and no one had come at him since, and 12 hours of being left alone had let him come down off the raw edge of his terror into something worse and stiller. A black wariness, a waiting. His head came up when the crowd thickened, and he ran the fence twice, and the crowd surged back laughing and shrieking. And Hannah stood at the gate and watched him move, and felt her heart do a thing it had not done in 2 years, which was break and set itself in the same beat. He was ribby and scarred and sour, and there was gray dust worked into his black hide like ash. He was also, under all of it, unmistakably, the best horse her husband ever made. And he floated over that churned ground like the trot had been poured into him from a pitcher, because it had. She knew who had poured it. 10 o'clock. Mrs. Calloway. Dunmore boomed from his gray, pulling his watch, playing the fence like a preacher. Doc's here. The hat's ready. And I've been generous. I've told the boys to pass it twice. The laughter rolled. He was magnificent, and the crowd loved him, and he tipped his hat to her the way you tip it to the condemned. Hannah unlatched the gate. What the town of Larkspur saw next was talked about, argued about, lied about, and preached on for the next 30 years, and no two accounts of it ever fully agreed, except on the time. Orrin Pruitt had his watch open on the rail from the moment the gate shut, because a bet was a bet and he was stakeholder, and Orrin Pruitt's watch is where the 15 minutes comes from, and on the 15 minutes every witness living and dead lines up square. She did not walk at the horse. She walked to the middle of the pen while he ran the far fence, and then she stopped, and turned her shoulder to him, and stood still. That was all. The crowd, primed for a fight or a funeral, began to jeer inside the first minute. Is that riding sigh? She's planted corn out there. And Dunmore milked it, and the Stallion ran, and Hannah Calloway stood in the middle of 2 acres of churned dirt, with her hands folded under her apron and her eyes on the ground. Doing, as far as 200 people could tell, absolutely nothing. What she was doing was breathing. Long, slow, and loud enough for a horse to hear, the way Tom breathed when he walked into a pen, a big, unhurried bellows sound that says, in the only language a run-down horse trusts, I am not hunting you. Nothing on this earth breathes slow while it hunts. And she was listening to the rhythm of his feet behind her, the panic gate shortening, the snorts coming down from scream pitch to blow to rattle, the circles shrinking as the thing in the middle of the pen went on being the only thing in his world that had ever stood in a corral with him and not come at him. It took 6 minutes for the running to stop. It felt, she said later, like 6 years. Then silence, and the crowd's noise died into it, because 200 people leaning on rails had gradually understood that they were watching something they had no name for. And behind her, close, she heard the ground shaking blow of a big horse clearing his nose, and then the soft chop of hooves walking, stopping, walking, stopping. She whistled. Low, 3 notes. The first bar of an old hymn slowed down, a sound that had not been heard on the D-bar or anywhere else on this earth in 2 years, because the man who owned it was under the cottonwoods on the hill behind her house. The Stallion's breath stopped. Every account agrees on this too. The horse made a sound. Webb Coulter, who was closest, said till his dying day it was not a whinny, it was lower. In the chest, the sound a horse makes across a stall wall to another horse it knows. And the black stallion that had put 2 men in splints and a buster in a wagon bed walked the last 12 feet of churned dirt on his own and put his ruined head down over Hannah Calloway's shoulder from behind. And she reached up one hand, without turning, and laid it flat on the great warm curve of his neck, and stood there with her eyes shut, while the muscle under her palm shivered and stilled, like ground after a train has passed. 8 minutes, said Orrin Pruitt's watch. She turned then, slow as syrup, and rubbed the crescent scar in front of the left ear with her thumb, exactly as she had the night she stitched it, and the horse blew against her apron and mouthed the cloth like a colt, and along the fence rail grown men took their hats off without noticing they were doing it, and Ellen Pruitt quietly stopped taking bets. Caleb Wade came to the gate and handed the hackamore across it, and the stallion threw his head once at the sight of gear. One full flinch of the whole body, braced for the thing that always came next, and then stood, trembling, while the widow showed it to him, let him breathe on the rawhide, and slid it up his black nose as gently as a woman dressing a wound. No bit, nothing that could ever be in a hand. She led him twice around the pen at a walk first, past Kittle on the fence, And the horse bunched and rolled the white of his eye at the man, at the quirt on his wrist, and 11 affidavits would eventually say so in a courtroom. And then she stepped up on the snubbing post stub and lay across his warm back a moment like a sack of oats, letting him feel the weight, and then she was up, astride, in a faded blue dress, on the man-killer of Larkspur County. 15 minutes, said Orrin Pruitt's watch, and Orrin Pruitt said it out loud, to the whole fence, in the voice of a man announcing a hymn number. 15 minutes. She rode him around the big pen once at a walk, and the only sound in the town of Larkspur was hoof falls. She rode him around a second time at that big floating trot, her braid coming loose down her back, one hand low on the rein and the other flat on his neck, and the horse moved under her like the 2 years had been a bad dream some other horse had, and Webb Coulter stood up off his nail keg with his ruined hip and his crutch and started it, one man clapping. It went down that fence like the fire had gone the day before, and by the time she brought the stallion back to the gate and stepped down onto her own 2 legs, as per the paper, the town that had laughed at her for 2 years straight was roaring her name, and hats were in the air, and the register man was writing so fast he tore the page. And the noise rolled out over the flats so that they heard it, faintly, at the section camp 7 miles east, and wondered who had died. Not one of them was looking at Cyrus Dunmore. Hannah was. She stood at the gate with her hand on the black neck and looked across all that jubilation straight at the man on the tall gray horse. And Cyrus Dunmore looked back at her. And he was not red-faced now, but white, bone china white, rigid, stunned past performing, and she watched the whole rest of the story arrive in his eyes like weather coming over a ridge. The bench. The spring, the crowd, the paper with his name on it, in the stakeholders' cash box, under a watch that said 15 minutes. Well, said Sheriff Dan Hobb into the din, to nobody in particular, wiping his eyes with his thumb. I have now seen everything the territory has to offer. He was wrong. The territory was just getting started. On Monday morning, Hannah Calloway put on her good gray dress and drove her borrowed neighbor's wagon into Larkspur to see about a deed, and was met at the door of Cyrus Dunmore's town office. Not by Cyrus Dunmore, but by a narrow young man from Helena named Mr. Lucius P. Greer, attorney at law, who smelled of bay rum and had a paper of his own. Mrs. Calloway, my client wishes you to understand there are no hard feelings whatsoever. Greer said it the way you'd read a recipe. But upon review, the memorandum of Saturday last is a nullity. It is a wagering contract, madam, a bet. And I am sure a lady does not follow the territorial reports. But the law on the point is quite settled. The courts of this territory will not enforce a gambling debt. Not a card debt, not a horse race debt, and not, however colorful the circumstances, this, the courts leave wagering parties precisely where it finds them. My client is not obliged to convey 1 acre, and, you will forgive the observation, you would not have been obliged to convey your homestead either, had matters gone the other way. Neither side could have compelled the other. It was, in law, a public entertainment. He smiled with the front of his face. My client is, however, prepared to be generous. In consideration of the exhibition, he is prepared to offer you $25. Hannah stood in the doorway with Saturday's paper in her hand, her copy, with the 12 names running up the margin, and she had the strange, clarifying sensation of watching a trap she had walked past on the way in swing shut on the way out. 200 witnesses, 12 signatures, a stakeholder, a watch, and none of it, according to a young man smelling of bay rum, worth $25 and a compliment. He put his name to it, she said. He put his name to a wager, madam. The law does not care. The town will. Greer tidied his cuff. The town, he said, banks with Mr. Finch, ships with the D-Bar, and carries its winter credit at stores that carry their paper to my client. The town will care for exactly one season. Mrs. Calloway towns always do. She was in the street with the sun on her before she let herself understand the rest of it, the part the lawyer had been too tidy to say, and had said anyway. Matters would not be left where they stood. She had shamed Cyrus Dunmore in front of 200 people with his own watch running. And men like Kittle got even with horses, and men like Dunmore got even with paper. It took him 9 days. On the Wednesday following, Aldous Finch sent a boy out to the creek place with a note asking her to call at the bank at her convenience, and when she came, the warm manner was gone like snow off a south slope. The Merchants' Bank, Finch explained, hands folded, had reviewed its obligations and sold certain of its notes to a private party, hers among them, nothing personal, done every day, and the private party, he did not say the name, and did not need to, was disinclined to renew, extend, or discuss. $300, the 15th of September. Paid in full, in coin, or the 40 acres went under the hammer on the courthouse steps. You sold my husband's note to the man who owes me a section of land, Hannah said. The bank sold an asset to a qualified buyer, said Finch, to his own folded hands. I'd counsel you not to repeat the other characterization. It borders on slander, and Mr. Greer is attentive to such things. That was July then, and this is what July was. The drought came on in earnest, the creek dropping to a chain of warm pools, the grass curing white, the sky a brass lid clamped on the county from Sunday to Sunday. The town divided the way towns do, not evenly, and not bravely. The Register ran the 15 minutes on the front page with the headline A Larkspur Wonder, and sold out the print run, and then ran nothing further about deeds or wagers at all, because the Register's building carried a mortgage, and the mortgage lived in Mr. Finch's vault. Men who had roared her name off that fence rail on Saturday touched their hats to her on Tuesday from the far side of the street, with a quick look up street first to see who was watching. The sewing circle called it, in Ellen Pruitt's phrase, a scandal and a shame and nobody's business to meddle in. All three at once. And a strange, quiet, opposite current set in under the surface, the way it does. Webb Coulter told the 15 minutes to every man who'd stand still for it, angrily, like Scripture being denied, and one by one, at dusk, by the back road. Wagons began turning in at the creek place, with a snuffy colt tied on behind, and a man on the seat saying some version of the same 7 words, "My wife heard what you done Saturday." She took them all. $2 a week per horse, gentle Tom's way, no bit, no spur, no crowd. And by August she had 9 head in the round corral Tom built, and a waiting list she kept on the back of Finch's bank notice, which gave her a private satisfaction she told no one about. It was not $300, run the sums however she ran them, by the lamp, at the kitchen table, on the backs of envelopes. $18 a week in gentling fees against seed, salt, shoeing, and the note. It landed her somewhere between $80 and $100 short of September the 15th, every time, in every hand she dealt it. But it was work, it was hers, and every finished colt that walked calm off her place into some homestead's harness was a small, quiet argument, staked out where the county could see it, about what exactly had happened in that pen in 15 minutes, and whether it had been witchcraft, luck, or a trade a woman might know better than a man. And the Stallion. The Stallion was the wound that would not close. Dunmore had him hazed back to the D-Bar the same Saturday evening, and what the D-Bar crew told the saloons. The saloons told the town that the Black Devil had gone back to war the moment Kittle's shadow crossed the pen, that he'd broken a gate and 2 poles inside a week, that Kittle had him tied down and was going to finish him for riding by fall or kill him trying. and had said, where several could hear it, that he did not much mind which. Twice in July, Hannah drove past the D-Bar road gate and saw him at a distance, a black shape alone in a dry paddock, head over the wire, facing. Caleb noticed it too, and neither of them said it aloud for a week, facing southwest, toward Larkspur Creek. "He'll kill that horse," she said finally. It was a Thursday evening. Caleb had come out to trim the 9 head, and stayed to mend the corral gate she had not asked him to mend, and they were standing at the rails in the smell of dust and dry grass, with the sun going down red as a stove ring through the haze. "Kittle?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Eventually, quick if the horse is lucky. I mean, to buy him." Caleb was quiet the length of time it took to test the gate hinge twice. "He knows that," he said. "It's the last card in his hand you want. He'll make you crawl for it, and then he won't sell it to you." He was half right, which with Caleb Wade was a poor average. It happened the first Saturday of August in front of Pruitt's store, and the county argued ever after about why Dunmore did it. Some said spite dressed up as theater. Some said Greer had told him to do something public and cheap about the horse before the horse did something public and expensive to Kittle, and Ellen Pruitt always swore it was simplest arithmetic. He wanted the widow dead, or crippled, and had found a way to buy the chance for $1. He came out of the store as Hannah was loading salt, with half of Saturday watching, and he said it loud, the old fence rail voice, the first time he had addressed her in public since the 15 minutes. "They tell me you've been asking after my man-killer Mrs. Calloway. I've been told he's for sale," Hannah said. "I've been told the price is more than a washing woman would see in 10 years. "For you," said Cyrus Dunmore, sweeping off his hat, playing to the boardwalk, his eyes as cold as the bottom of a well, $1. And as the boardwalk gasped and tittered, he leaned in, close, quiet, just for her, the crowd voice gone entirely. "Take him home, and let him finish what he started on Better People Than You. Or watch Ray finish him. I win it either way, and it cost me $1 to watch." Every head on the boardwalk was craned. The register man was in the door of the barber shop with lather on his jaw. Hannah Calloway looked at Cyrus Dunmore for a long moment, and then she opened the drawstring purse that held, at that particular moment, $4 and some cents of the money that stood between her and the courthouse steps, and she took out $1 silver and put it in his open palm without letting her fingers touch him. "Write it down," she said, for the second time that summer, and the boardwalk laughed, at him this time, just a little. Just the front edge of it, and Dunmore heard it, and something went across his face like the shadow of a bird. Orrin Pruitt wrote out the bill of sale then and there against his ledger stand. 1 black stallion, unbranded, known as the D-Bar Killer, sold and delivered for $1 cash in hand. C. Dunmore to H. Calloway, and the same Sheriff Hobb witnessed it, saying nothing this time, not smiling this time. It was the only contract Cyrus Dunmore honored all summer. She always said afterward it was the best dollar anybody in her family ever spent, and the most expensive one Dunmore ever pocketed, because the horse he sold her for it was the horse that would, inside of 8 months, cost him the bench, the county, and the name he had spent 30 years building. Though not one soul standing on that boardwalk could have guessed the road it would take to get there, and the road ran, first, straight through the worst night of her life. She went for him the next morning with Caleb Wade and Caleb's stoutest wagon team, though in the end the wagon was never needed. The D-Bar crew had him in the dry paddock behind the horse barn, and they had gathered along the fence to watch the show, a dozen hands with their hats tipped back, and Rafe Kittle sat the top rail with the loaded quirt across his knees, stroking the braided fall of it with 2 fingers, slow, the way another man might stroke a cat. "Come to collect your dollar horse," he said. "I was 3 weeks from having him gentle." "I've seen you're gentle," Hannah said. It's sitting on a nail keg in town, and it can't feel its right leg." Kittle's face did not change, and that was the most instructive thing about the whole morning, because a slandered man flushes or laughs or comes off the fence, and Kittle only looked at her, pale-eyed, patient, filing her away, and said, softly, "Horses fall. Mrs. Horses fall on whoever's up. You'd want to bear that in mind, the company you're keeping now." And to the day she died, she never told anyone, not even Caleb, how cold that soft little sentence went through her, because she understood it was not a remark about the past. It was a remark about the future. Diamond came off the D-bar the way he had come off the war, braced for it. He was 70 pounds lighter than he had been in June, gaunted, sucked up, a crescent of new proud flesh over the off hip, and when she came into the paddock with a hackamore, he stood shaking in the far corner, and it took her 40 minutes this time, not 15. Because this pen was not neutral ground. This pen was where the lessons had happened. But the whistle still held. It was the one thing the winter had not gotten at, the one door in the burned house still hanging square on its hinges, and when he finally crossed that paddock and put his head down over her shoulder, one of the younger D-bar hands, a Texas boy of about 25, took his hat off, said, "I'm quittin' Friday," to no one at all, and walked back to the bunkhouse. That happened. It went into the affidavits, too. She led the stallion home 11 miles on a cotton rope, walking most of it, Caleb bringing the team a quarter-mile back like a man riding drag on a herd of 2, and the horse walked the last mile ahead of her, pulling, and when he came through the gate of the creek place, past the kitchen side shed where he had been foaled, he stopped in the middle of the yard and stood absolutely still for the better part of 2 minutes, head high, nostrils working, reading the wind off the round corral, the cottonwoods, the graveyard hill, the whole map of the first 3 years of his life, and then he let out a long, shuddering breath, the kind that empties a horse from the hocks up, and dropped his head, and began, quietly, to graze her yard grass like any settled saddle horse in the territory. Caleb Wade, who had not said a word in 4 miles, cleared his throat and observed that he had shod maybe 4,000 head in his life and had just seen the first one he'd call cured of something, and Hannah stood with the slack rope in her hand and let 2 tears get past her. Exactly 2. The first the county had never seen and did not see then, because the only witnesses were a farrier who looked deliberately at the tree line, and a horse. The healing of that horse through August became, without her intending it, a public event held in private. She was 3 weeks feeding him back, crushed oats, molasses, cut green feed, hauled from the creek bottom, while her own pasture burned brown, and it was in the 2nd week, working tallow into his hide of an evening, that she lifted the heavy black mane on the off side, and went still, and called Caleb over from the forge cart with a voice she did not quite own. Under the mane, hidden the way a careful man hides them, the whole crest and upper neck were ridged with old wire-cut wheels, some gray with age, some pink, some new since June, laid in cross-hatched and parallel, the unmistakable signature of a loaded quirt applied at leisure to a tied animal over months, where a buyer's eye and a judge's eye and a wife's eye would never go. Caleb looked for a long time, jaw working once, and then he went to his cart and came back with the tally book he kept shoeing accounts in, and drew the pattern of the scarring in careful pencil, dated the page, and had her sign under his own name as witness. "Why paper?" she asked. "Because a season from now," Caleb said, "when this county finally sobers up and asks itself what was actually done out there, it'll want the answer written down by somebody dull. And nobody's ever accused me of poetry." Webb Coulter drove out that Sunday, his sister handling the lines, and stood on his crutch at the corral fence for an hour watching the black horse Doe's hip shot in the shade like a plow pony, and what he said at the end of the hour he said with his voice shaking. Kittle told it all winter, the horse was born wrong. Born a killer, he says. I rode that winter string every day till April, Mrs., and I'll say to a judge's face what I couldn't say to my bosses. The only thing that horse was ever guilty of was learning what a man's hand meant faster than the rest of the string. I lost my hip to what Rafe Kittle made, not to what God made. He put his hat back on. You go to law over that bench, and you find yourself needing a cripple's word for anything at all. You send for me. I owe that horse an apology, and I mean to pay it somewhere it counts. Go to law. Everyone said it to her that August, in one tone or another. Webb Coulter like an oath, Ellen Pruitt like a dare, Caleb like a man reading weather. The truth, which she kept behind her stillness where she kept everything, was that she had already begun. It had started with Orrin Pruitt, of all people, the second week of July, when Dunmore's lawyer had come into the store with a paper demanding the storekeeper surrender the signed wager memorandum to its author, quote, for safekeeping, unquote. And Orrin Pruitt, a round, mild, careful man who had not contradicted anybody since the Grant administration, had astonished himself and the whole county by saying no. He was stakeholder, he said. Both parties had put their names in his keeping. He would hand that paper to a district judge, or to nobody. And he had put it in the store, safe behind the daybooks, and turned the dial and stood in front of it polishing his spectacles, terrified and immovable. A fat little monument to the one religion Larkspur actually practiced, which was that a written bet is holy. And it had gone on with Milo Hart, the editor of the Register, a stooped, dry, coughing man of 50 who had read law for 2 years in Ohio before ink got him, and who had not printed one word about the wagers since June, because the mortgage on his press lived in Finch's vault. He came out to the creek place after dark, the second Saturday of August, like a man visiting a sporting house, sat at her kitchen table, and unwrapped from a flour sack 3 volumes of the territorial reports and a 4th book, fat and green, of contract law. I can't print what I think, Mrs. Calloway, he said. I've a press to lose, and I'm not brave. It shames me, and there it is. But nobody watches what I lend. He opened the green book to a page he had marked with a broom straw. Now Greer's told you, and Greer's right. A wager won't lie in a territorial court. Both stakes fall, nobody collects, the law goes home disgusted. If what happened at those pens in June was a bet between you and Cyrus Dunmore, you will lose, and you'll lose the filing fee besides. He turned the book toward her, and his ink-stained finger came down on the margin. But you were on that fence, same as me. Think back before you ever said a word about your 40. What did the man do? He stood up on a rail in front of 200 people, of his own free notion, and he offered the Cottonwood Bench to any woman who could ride that stallion. An offer, Mrs., public as a handbill. A prize for the doing of a thing, like a reward poster, like a purse hung on a race. And an offer like that doesn't need your land against it, and doesn't need his kindness after it. It needs one thing only. He looked at her over his spectacles, coughing his little dry cough, his eyes bright as a jay's. Performance. Somebody has to go and do the thing offered. Before witnesses. Say 200 of them. Say inside 15 minutes, by the stakeholder's own watch. Hannah sat looking at the page a long while, at the cramped lines of some dead judge's reasoning, in a case about a shipwrecked salvage purse, and she felt the shape of it settle over the memory of that Saturday, like a key trying a lock. He offered first. The 40 had been her idea, her pride, hedging his charity into a contest, and Greer had seized on her own pride to void the whole morning. Strip her stake back out of it, and what was left standing was Cyrus Dunmore. alone, on a rail, offering land to any woman who could ride his horse, and a woman who had then ridden his horse. "He'll say it was drink talk," she said. "Crowd talk. Not meant. He will. And there's law on that too. A man's secret meaning don't signify. What signifies is what a reasonable body standing at that fence understood him to offer. So the case is the fence misses. The case is 200 reasonable bodies." Milo Hart shut the book and pushed all four across the table to her, and stood and picked up his hat, and at the door he paused the way Caleb did. And it occurred to her that courage in Larkspur seemed only able to operate in doorways, at night, one visitor at a time. "District Court sits at Larkspur the 9th of September. Judge Amos Toole presiding," he said. "Filing fees $4. Tull's hard, and he's rude, and he's got no love for stock kings. File it yourself, in your own hand. It'll read badly, and that will read well." He coughed. "I'd be obliged you never say where the books came from." She filed the second Monday of August, at the courthouse, in her own hand, paying the $4.25 in dimes out of a tobacco tin, with the clerk's pen scratching in a silence you could have hung meat in, Calloway against Dunmore, in the matter of a public offer performed. By supper time it was in every parlor in the county. By Thursday it was in the Helena papers. And by the following week, Cyrus Dunmore had done the arithmetic of his position. A courtroom, an open gallery, 200 subpoenable witnesses, a stakeholder's safe he could not open, and a plaintiff he had already twice made the mistake of meeting in public, and had reached with Greer, and with the pale-eyed patient man who kept his quirts oiled, the conclusion that the case must never be tried on its facts. The facts had a way, lately, of siding with the widow. The facts, then, would have to be changed. September came in hot and hazed, the creek down to a trickle you could step over, thunder walking the ridges every evening and never breaking, the whole county cocked like a hammer. The hearing was set for the 9th. On the night of the 6th, they came for the horse. She woke a little after 2 to the sound she was always half listening for, even asleep, horses moving wrong. Not the shuffling and blowing of penned stock riding out a thunder night, but the drum of hooves at a panicked run, going away. She was on the porch in her nightgown with the shotgun before she was fully awake, and the sky lit white to the northwest and showed it to her all at once, like a photograph taken by God, the round corral standing open on the near side, not the gate. The rails, 3 of them, dropped clean out of their sockets and laid aside in the grass by hands that knew corrals, and the pasture gate beyond standing wide, and the last of 11 head going through it at a dead run into the dark, driven, and behind them, swinging wide, 2 riders. She fired both barrels at the sky for the noise of it, and heard, between the thunderclaps, a man laugh. By the time she had a lantern lit and her boots on, the rain had come at last, the whole brass month of it in 1 hour. A hammering gray wall that beat the dust to soup and wiped every track on the place smooth as a licked plate. She saddled her old gelding bareheaded in the downpour, and she was cinching up when Caleb Wade came up the road at a high lope, with a slicker and a second lantern, because Caleb Wade had spent the last 3 nights sleeping in his wagon in the cottonwoods below her south fence line. On his own counsel, having done his own arithmetic about hearings, and facts, and pale-eyed men, and told her none of it. "Count," he shouted through the rain. All 11 gone. 9 of them client horses, Caleb, the Whetstein girl's mare, Coulter's nephew's roan. Her voice did a thing it had not done all summer, and she caught it and strangled it. 9 gentled colts, belonging to 9 families that had trusted the widow against the tide of the whole county, scattered into a storm-black night full of wire, badger holes, and coulees running 6 feet of brown water. It was not an attack on a horse. It was an attack on the only thing she had left, the thing the 15 minutes had built. Let the county's colts come home cut, crippled, or not at all, and no affidavit on earth would put the families back on her side of the street come the 9th. Whoever had laid those rails aside so gently had understood her business to the bone. They rode all night, the two of them, quartering the flats between lightning strokes. And the story of that night was told afterward in 9 kitchens rather than 1 courtroom, which is how it lasted. They found the client horses the way you find beads off a broken string. The roan and the 2 Hollis fillies bunched in a fence corner 2 miles east, shaking, the Whetstein mare belly deep in the running coulee. And Caleb went in after her on foot, with the water at his armpits, and got a rope on her, and Hannah's gelding hauled them both out of the brown boil of it, the paint colt tangled, one hind leg wrapped twice in down wire, standing still as a church, because 8 weeks in a widow's round corral had taught him that when a thing has hold of you, you wait. And she talked to him for 10 minutes in the rain with the wire cutters, and he waited and walked out of it with cuts she could close with salve. By gray, streaming daybreak they had 8. The 9th, an old trader's pony, came home by himself at noon looking embarrassed. Not one animal of the 9 was lost. The county heard that, too, and heard what it cost. The farrier half drowned, the widow 18 hours in the saddle, and neither of them once, all night, riding after their own interest, because the 11th horse, the black one, the dollar horse, the whole quarrel. They had left for last, both knowing it, neither saying it. They cut his sign at mid-afternoon, and it told the story plain as print. 2 shod horses had come in behind him and driven him. Not scattered him, driven him, turning when he turned, 3 miles northwest, away from the creek, away from town, out toward the broken country along the rimrock, where the old wire from a failed sheep outfit lay coiled in the grass like something waiting to be paid. And there, in a blind draw with the rain washing it, the sign said the black horse had done what the men driving him had not reckoned on, refused the country they were pushing him toward, wheeled through them, and paid for it. There was black horsehair on the top strand of a down fence, and blood on the grass beyond it, a smeared trail of it going home. Home southwest, toward the creek place. The kitchen shed, the graveyard hill, the one map he trusted. And snagged in the barbs of the cut strand where he'd gone over, sodden and shining, hung a braided rawhide quirt with a loaded fall, wire woven into the plate of it, its wrist loop torn through. Caleb Wade got down in the rain and looked at it a long time without touching it, and then he took off his hat, which he had not done all night, and put it back on, and said, in exactly the voice a man reads a hymn number in, "Kept you oiled all these years, and you turn on him at the last. There's hope for this county yet." And then he cut the whole section of wire out of the fence with the quirt still snagged in it, 6 feet of evidence with the evidence woven in, wrapped it in his slicker, and never let it out of arm's reach for the next 70 hours. They found Diamond at dusk, standing in the yard he had been stolen out of, at the round corral gate, waiting to be let in. He had come home 11 miles, alone, through storm country he had never crossed, over or through 4 fences, with a wire gash along his near chest and shoulder as long as a man's forearm, deep at the top. Blowing steam, black legs sheeted dark with rain and blood, and when the lantern came around the corner of the house, he lifted his ruined beautiful head and nickered at her, low, in the chest, the sound across a stall wall, and Hannah Calloway walked the last 10 steps to that horse, the way a woman walks in church, and stood there in the rain with her forehead against his wet neck for a moment. Nobody in the county ever got told about at all. Then she went to work. Doc Ellison was a people's doctor, and 40 minutes away besides. There was nobody coming. She had Caleb hold the lantern and the twitch she did not need. The horse stood for her, shaking, his nose in her apron, exactly as he had stood at 5 months old with a chicken coop nail's damage in his face, and she boiled her silk. and cleaned the gash with carbolic, long past the point her own hands were steady from cold, and put 31 stitches into the chest and shoulder of the man-killer of Larkspur County, by lantern light, in the rain, in the dark of the morning of the 8th of September, while the farrier held the light and said nothing whatsoever. And the third time her hands failed her, he simply put his free hand flat between her shoulder blades and left it there until the shaking stopped. And that was the whole of what passed between them. And it was, both of them said in their different ways much later, more than enough to be going on with. Sheriff Dan Hobb came out at noon on the 8th, looked at the laid-aside rails, the emptied pasture, the horse wearing 31 stitches, and the section of fence wire in Caleb's slicker with the loaded quirt snagged in its barbs, and stood chewing his mustache for a while. "I know whose that is," he said finally. "So do you. Sold every man on that jury panel, and I'll tell you what a lawyer'd tell you. It proves a quirt got left on a fence." He rolled it in the slicker again, careful all the same, and tied it behind his own saddle. "But I'll book it in, and I'll say where it came off, and under oath if I'm asked." He gathered his reins and paused, looking at the horse, at the stitches, at the small, gray-faced woman standing between them, and something in the sheriff's official weariness cracked at the seam. "For whatever it weighs with you, Mrs., man keeps the peace in a county 20 years. He gets so he can smell which way it's fixing to break. It's fixing to break your way. They know it too. That's what last night was." He touched his hat. 9th, 9 o'clock. "I'd come early. There won't be seats." He was right about the seats. What Dan Hobb could not have told her, because no one in Larkspur knew it yet, was that the other thing broke her way that same evening, at the D-bar itself, at the cookhouse table, where a one-armed 23-year-old named Denny Marsh sat listening to two hands tell it low and laughing, about the storm, the rails, the widow's string, scattered 11 ways. And Rafe gone all peculiar over losing that quirt of his, and Denny Marsh looked down at the dead weight where his roping arm used to be, the arm the papers and the bunkhouse and his own boss had all agreed was the price of a born killer and nobody's fault, and he understood, arriving at it the slow way a young man arrives at the first entirely his own thought of his life. That he had been lied to about the horse, and that if he had been lied to about the horse, he had been lied to about the arm. He got up from the table, left his plate, walked to the foreman's room past Kittle's open door, took his time and his wages from the box like any quitting hand, and then rode, not to town, but 4 miles up Larkspur Creek in the dark. To a lit kitchen window he had no reason on earth to trust, except the one reason that had been growing in the county all summer like grass coming back after fire. Hannah opened the door. The boy stood on her porch, hat in his one hand, gray as paper, and got it out all at once, the way you pull a splinter, ma'am. "I was there when Rafe made that horse what he was, and I never said nothing. And it cost Webb his hip after it cost me my arm, and I'm done with it. I hear there's a hearing tomorrow. I don't know what it's about, land or bets or what all, but if there's a Bible in that courtroom, I got things to say over it." Behind her, from the dark of the yard, came the low sound a horse makes across a stall wall to a horse it knows. Some men would have run. Denny Marsh, one armed in the lamplight, looked toward the corral for a long moment, and then he laughed unsteady and wiped his eyes on his sleeve and said the last thing anyone said on that porch before the day that changed the county well. "I guess he'd know me. I'm the one used to bring him his oats, before all of it. Only good job I had out there, and I never once got throwed doing it." After the boy had eaten and been sent to sleep in the hayshed, Hannah did the last thing on her list. She dragged Tom's trunk out from under the bed, where it had sat unopened for 2 years, because opening it cost more than she'd had to spend, and she went through it by lamplight to the bottom, past the wedding coat and the silk thread box, and the breeding book in Tom's terrible handwriting. Diamond, black horse colt, out of Dulcie, foaled the 14th of January, the finest thing this outfit will ever raise, T.C., until she found the paper the bank's men had left her the October of the auction. The settlement sheet, every animal, every price, every buyer, in the appraiser's copperplate. And there it was, the 11th line down, exactly as she had remembered it every day since June, and better than she had dared hope. One black stallion, 3 years old, green broke, the Calloway stud colt, $40, C. Dunmore, his own name. His own bid, his own receipt, initialed at the margin. The county said the widow had known that horse and never let on. The paper said the rich man had bought that horse out of her own dooryard, from under her own porch, at the sale of her own husband's estate, and had simply never troubled to know what he was buying, then or since. She folded it into the apron pocket where the bank notice had ridden all summer, and it seemed to her the pocket weighed different now. And she slept. The 9th of September broke still and copper-hazed, and by 8 o'clock there was not a hitching space on the 4 streets of Larkspur, and by 9 the courtroom held 240 souls by the bailiff's count, with the windows full of shoulders and boys in the cottonwood outside relaying proceedings to the crowd below like a bucket line. Judge Amos Toole came down from Helena on the circuit, a dry, savage old man with a face like a hatchet wrapped in parchment, famous in 3 counties for despising lawyers, ranchers, newspapers, weather, and above all else, wasted time. He looked out at the packed room the way a man looks at weeds, established with 4 questions that the plaintiff had no counsel and the defendant had Greer, and made a small sound in his nose that the front rows swore afterward was the whole verdict delivered early. Her case went in plain. Orrin Pruitt, sweating through his good coat, produced the memorandum from the store safe and his watch with it, and read the 12 names off the margin like a muster roll, and told the 15 minutes to a room so quiet the courthouse clock could be heard arguing with itself. Sheriff Hobb confirmed his own signature. Doc Ellison confirmed his. Webb Coulter came up the aisle on his crutch with his hat in his hand and told what he'd seen from the nail keg, and when Greer, on his feet, wondered aloud whether a man dosed nightly with laudanum could be sure of what he saw, Webb Coulter looked at him for a moment and said, "Young man, I was sure enough to put $40 on her at 12 to 1. And the courtroom had to be gavelled quiet for a full minute, and even Tull's hatchet face moved at one corner. Then Greer did what he was paid for. He conceded the ride, conceded it handsomely, called it the most remarkable feat of horsemanship in the territory's annals, and the room settled warmly into the flattery, just as he turned it over and showed the blade. Remarkable, he said. And now they knew why. The plaintiff had not tamed an outlaw in 15 minutes. No mortal hand could. She had performed a reunion and sold it to 200 honest people as a miracle. That horse was her own husband's colt, raised at her own hip, trained to her own whistle, and she had known it the moment she looked through those rails, and had said not one word of it to the man whose land she then proposed to win. Silence, gentlemen, can lie as loud as words. If there was a contract at that fence, it was got by concealment, by a false front, by the oldest game there is, the sharper who knows the horse, and a contract got by fraud, your honor dies of it." He sat down into an ugly, swelling murmur, and Hannah felt the room tilt away from her, felt 240 people remember the whistle, the scar, the impossible quarter hour, and retell it to themselves in Greer's voice, and she stood up into that tilt, with one paper in her hand, and no lawyer between her and the cliff, which was, though she could not know it, exactly how Amos Tull liked his mornings. "Your honor, Mr. Greer says I knew the horse. I did. He was foaled on my kitchen straw the 14th of January, 1882. I sat up 11 nights with him, I sewed that scar by his left ear when he was 5 months old, and my husband gentled him to a hackamore in the corral he built me for a wedding present. And there was never a whip on our place, and that is why, and the only why, a woman could ride him in 15 minutes when better riders than I am were carried out of that pen. It wasn't a miracle. I've never claimed one. It was my husband's work, still standing, under 2 years of another man's damage, and if knowing a horse's quality when the whole county calls it trash is fraud, then every man who ever bought a yearling cheap at a fool's sale belongs in jail with me. She laid the settlement sheet on the rail for the bailiff. But here's the part Mr. Greer's client forgot to tell him. The defendant didn't meet that stallion in June, Your Honor. He bought that stallion 2 years ago this October, at my husband's estate sale, in my dooryard. 11th line down. The Calloway stud colt, his own bid, $40, his own initials against the price. Cyrus Dunmore owned the best horse my husband ever bred for 2 full years, with the bill in his desk saying exactly what it was and exactly where it came from, and he stood on his fence in June and called it a man-killer and bet a section of land on it, because in 2 years he never once troubled to look at what he had. I didn't conceal that horse from Mr. Dunmore. She turned, for the first time in the whole proceeding, and looked at the rancher in the second row, and the courtroom turned with her, the way the fence had turned in June. You cannot conceal from a man, Your Honor, what he has owned all along and never bothered to see. The room did not gavel quiet in a minute this time. It took 3. And men were standing at the back, and somewhere in the gallery a woman said clear through the din, Ellen Pruitt as it happened, changing sides in public with the fearless promptness of the truly social. Well, she has him there. And Amos Toole hammered them all down, with his face gone dangerously pleasant. The rest of it had the terrible smooth speed of a thing going downhill on greased skids. Tull took the concealment defense apart in 4 sentences. The buyer's own receipt defeats it. A seller's widow owes no man an appraisal of his own property. Move along, Mr. Greer. Greer wisely moved along to the wager, his good ground, the settled law, and for 10 minutes he was even winning on it. Until Toole, reading the memorandum again with his spectacles down his nose, asked him, mildly, at what o'clock the defendant had first offered the section, because it says here witnesses put the offer from the rail some minutes before the plaintiff spoke of her 40 acres at all, and was the court to understand that Mr. Dunmore's public promise of land to any woman who could ride the horse required the widow's stake to exist, when by every affidavit it existed already, complete, of the defendant's own free proposing, needing nothing from her but the doing of the thing? The courtroom watched Lucius P. Greer stand entirely still for 4 seconds, which is a long time in a courtroom, and Milo Hart, taking shorthand in the front row with a face of scholarly calm, wrote in the margin of his pad the 3 words he later had framed over the press. He sees it. Judge Tull ruled from the bench the same afternoon, in a courtroom hushed like weather about to change, and Milo Hart printed the ruling entire, and the print run sold to Helena and back, and the heart of it stripped of the Latin. Ran so, the stakes were a wager, and a wager the court will not touch. The plaintiff's 40 acres were never in lawful hazard, and neither as a bet was the defendant's section. On that ground Mr. Greer is quite right, and if that were the whole morning, the parties could go home. But the evidence of 200 fences, the court's own phrase, the county wore it like a ribbon for years, establishes that before any wager was spoken, the defendant, of his own motion, publicly and repeatedly offered to convey the Cottonwood Bench to any woman who should ride that stallion, that such an offer, like a posted reward, wants no acceptance but performance. That the plaintiff performed it completely before the largest body of witnesses ever assembled to a contract in this district. within 15 minutes by the stakeholders' watch, that the defendant's memorandum, signed by his own hand the same hour, is written proof of the offer's terms against him, and that a man may not summon a crowd, promise land in the plainness of English, watch the thing done, and then send to Helena for a Latin word to fetch him out of it. Judgment for the plaintiff. The defendant to execute and deliver a good and sufficient deed to the section known as the Cottonwood Bench, 640 acres with the spring, within 30 days, and to pay the costs of the action. And then, Amos Toole did the thing nobody had come for, and everybody remembered longest. He held up the second paper the sheriff had booked in. He had allowed the quirt, the wire, the tally book drawing, Denny Marsh's flat one-armed testimony and Webb Coulter's over Greer's objections, because Greer himself had put the horse's nature at issue, and the door once opened had let the whole winter through it, and he looked over his spectacles at Rafe Kittle, seated pale and patient by the aisle, and informed him that the matters testified to this day lay past a civil court's reach, but not past a grand jury's, that the clerk was instructed to transmit the record to the district attorney, and that in the court's private opinion, offered freely and without charge, the only born killer to appear anywhere in this case had appeared in it wearing boots. Rafe Kittle sat through it without moving anything but his eyes. He was gone from the county by Thursday, between a dusk and a dawn, leaving wages uncollected, seen once more, years later, by a Larkspur man passing through a Wyoming stock camp, working the far edge of a horse herd, alone. And nobody, the man said, would partner with him even there, because the story had gotten there first. It was, the county agreed, a sentence of a kind, and maybe the fitting one, to live the rest of his life the way he'd made that horse live. Watched, avoided, and known. The deed was recorded on the 20th of September, and the county clerk, a man not historically given to gesture, blotted it, stamped it, and then stood up behind his counter and shook her hand. But the 15th had come before the 20th, and the summer's other paper had fallen due in the middle of the victory, like a stone dropped in a wedding, which was, of course, precisely how it had been aimed. Cyrus Dunmore might lose a section in front of the territory. He still held a $300 note against her 40, and the law that had given her the bench would just as evenly take the home place, and there was a bitter symmetry in it that Greer, at least, could savor. Let the widow have her prize, and lose her porch, her garden, her round corral, and the hill where Tom lay under the cottonwoods. What saved the 40 was the bench itself, and the drought, and the plain arithmetic that had been hiding under the whole quarrel from the start, because the section Cyrus Dunmore had bet away as a rich man's flourish was, in a burned white year, worth more than any other 1,000 acres in the county. The spring had run all summer while the creeks quit. The sub-irrigated meadow along the foot of the rim stood in grass to a horse's knee, cured on the stem. The only honest hay from Larkspur to the county line, and buyers had begun asking after it before the ink on the deed was dry. She cut it with hired crews on shares, half the crews, men who had laughed at her from the fence rail in June, and she hired them anyway, at the going wage, without one word of sauce, which unsettled Larkspur more than the lawsuit had. And by the 8th of October, she had sold 90 tons at $8.50 the ton, delivered, to outfits that would have starved without it. On the 11th of October, Hannah Calloway walked into the merchant's bank in her good gray dress, counted out $300 in gold and notes onto Aldous Finch's polished counter before witnesses, took up her husband's paper, and asked, politely, for a match. Finch, who understood at last which way the county had broken, and who would spend the next decade being reminded by his wife that he had once dunned the owner of the bench over a fellow cracked wagon, produced one from his own vest. She burned the note in the bank's own ashtray, thanked him for the bank's many courtesies to her family, and walked out. Milo Hart did not print that. He said the front page was too small for it. Winter came early that year, and it came for the proud. The first blizzard rolled down out of the north on the 9th of November, 3 weeks ahead of anybody's reckoning, and it was the winter the old men still measured winters against a generation later. The wind that did not stop for 11 days. The snow that crusted so cattle could not paw through. The cold that cracked axe handles. The big outfits had spent the drought summer holding their herds on the open range, betting on a soft fall the way they had always bet, and the range took its payment. The D-bar went into that winter with 4,000 head and came out in the green up with 1,100, and Cyrus Dunmore's paper, the notes he held on half of Main Street, the credit that had made towns careful, turned out to be pinned, all of it, to cattle that were drifted into coulees under 10 feet of snow, and the banks in Helena that had always smiled at his signature stopped smiling in February and called what they held, and there was nobody left in the county either able or inclined to carry him. It was not the widow who broke Cyrus Dunmore. She never once raised a hand to him after September. It was the winter, and the arithmetic, and 30 years of never troubling to look at what he had, and the county understood that too. And understood that it could have been no other way, and that she had somehow known it, standing quiet at his fence in June while he laughed. Her stock lived, all of it. She had wintered 11 horses and 40 head of bought yearling cattle on the bench, in the sheltered coulees below the rim where the spring ran warm enough to stay open, with 90 tons of her own hay stacked and fenced. She had sold 90 tons and kept 90, over Caleb's mild suggestion that she was hoarding like a squirrel with a premonition, to which she had replied only that she'd been poor longer than he had, and through the worst 11 days of it, she and Caleb and Denny Marsh, who worked for her now at full wages, and half the sass of a two-armed man, went out on the stack sled every single morning. And the black stallion broke trail for the team through drifts chest deep, leaning into it, steaming like an engine, doing it 7 years old, in the wind, the work he had been bred on a $10 dun mare to do. There is a photograph of it, the only photograph of him that exists. The Register sent a man out on snowshoes in January, because Milo Hart had a nose for what a front page was actually for, and it ran under a one-word headline, and the word was diamond, and it sold out 3 printings, and in kitchens where the 15 minutes had been called witchcraft 8 months before, the picture of the man-killer of Larkspur County chest deep in a killing winter, hauling hay to another man's orphaned cattle, was cut out, and saved, and is in albums in that county yet. Cyrus Dunmore came to her gate in the last week of March, in the mud time, riding one of the 3 horses the Banks had left him, and he came alone. She saw him from the corral and walked down, and they stood with the gate between them, the big red-faced man gone loose in his coat like a sail, with the wind out of it, and the small woman in the faded blue dress, and for a while neither said anything, because between them stood a summer, a courtroom, a quirt, a night of rain, and 640 acres, and both of them knew exactly which of the two had more right to close the gate. "I'm told you've got sound young work teams to sell," he said at last. "Nobody else this side of Helena has anything on 4 legs worth the name. I've got spring work or I've got nothing, and I can pay for 6 head. Barely, he looked past her shoulder, at the black horse watching him from the corral with its ears up, and his jaw worked, and what came out of him came out rusty, like pump water in April, but it came. "I said once you'd not get an acre of mine while I lived. My lawyer found me 9 ways to keep that promise, and I paid for all 9. I'd have done better to pay for one look at that horse 2 years sooner. It was as close to the word sorry as the county records show him ever coming, and she let it be close enough, because Tom had held that mercy was mostly arithmetic too. It costs $1 today, he used to say, and pays the county back for years. She sold Cyrus Dunmore 6 honest workhorses at the fair market price, not a dime over and not a dime under, and threw in, before witnesses, because some habits had served her well, 30 days of her own time to see the team settled to his remaining men, who had never in their lives worked stock without a whip on the saddle, and who learned. That was the spring the D-bar hands started calling her ma'am without smirking, and the spring Ellen Pruitt's sewing circle asked her, formally, on notepaper to join. She went twice a year. Which was, Ellen agreed, exactly the right amount for a woman with 2 ranches, and the spring the county quit saying the widow Calloway in the tone reserved for broken axles, and began saying it the way you say a landmark. Ask at the depot how far to water, and a man would tell you, 11 miles, the Calloway place. She'll let you tank up and she'll look at your lame mare while you do it. And mister, take your hat off through the gate. The gate itself came in April, and it was Caleb Wade's doing, and it was the nearest thing to a speech he ever made. He had been at the creek place or the bench most days of that whole year, shoeing, mending, holding lanterns, sleeping in cottonwoods he was never asked to sleep in, and never once in all of it had he said a word about what everybody from Ellen Pruitt to the depot agent had long since said for him. He was not a man who could talk that way, and she was not by then a woman who needed it that way. And the county, which had been wrong about her in every particular for 2 years, watched the two of them with a proprietary tenderness it had certainly not earned. What Caleb did instead of talking was work 6 weeks of evenings at his forge with the doors shut. And on a bright, raw April morning, he drove out to the bench with a tarp over his wagon bed, and dug 2 post holes at the head of the spring road without asking anybody, and set into them a pair of juniper posts and an overhead rail, and hung from the rail, in iron letters a foot high, hand-drawn, hand-cut, with the hammer marks left showing, because he held that hammer marks were the truth of a thing. Dust A&D Diamond Ranch, and under it, small. In letters you had to be through the gate to read, T.C., 1882. She stood looking up at it for a long time, at the name she had never told him, because there was only one place he could have gotten it, from Tom, from some noon at the forge years ago, some passing remark about a coal-black colt and a $10 mare, filed away for 6 years in that slow, deliberate, load-bearing silence. When she could talk, she said, "That's the mare's name and the colt's name both." "You knew that. Knew it was the outfit's name," Caleb said. "Whole time. Just waited for the outfit. I can't pay a blacksmith for a gate like this." "Ain't a bill," he said, and looked at the rimrock a while, and then did the bravest thing any man did in that county in that decade, braver than the pen. Braver than the courtroom. He looked straight at her and said what he had come to say. All of it. Both sentences. "I'm not looking for wages, Hannah, and I'm not looking to be kept on. I'm asking to be let in the gate." And Hannah Calloway, who had given the county nothing to read for 3 years, stood in the mud of her own road under her husband's initials and her new iron name, and read him everything, and what she said back was exactly as long as what he'd said, and it did for the both of them for the next 31 years. Then put your anvil where I can hear it. They were married in June, 1 year almost to the Saturday from the shipping pens, by the same minister who had buried Tom, in a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes and was witnessed, because some habits had served her well, by Webb Coulter, Denny Marsh, Orrin and Ellen Pruitt, Milo Hart, Sheriff Dan Hobb, and, tied to the churchyard fence in a braided rawhide hackamore, dozing hip-shot in the sun like a plow pony, the man-killer of Larkspur County. She did not wear black to it, and she did not wear blue. She wore gray, and Ellen Pruitt cried, and Caleb Wade shod horses the following Monday with the ring on a rawhide cord under his shirt. And life, which is not a courtroom and keeps no gallery, simply went on, the way she had always trusted it would if a person could just stay standing long enough. And it went on well. That is the part of the story the county liked best to tell afterward, and the part that wants the least telling, the way good pasture wants the least talk. Dust and Diamond ran horses on the bench for as long as its iron gate stood, and the Calloway wade stock carried that big floating trot into half the corrals in the state, and army buyers and stage lines learned the brand and paid the premium, and every animal that ever left through that gate had been made, not broken, no spade bits, no loaded quirts, no fear on the place. Because the woman who owned it held and proved for 30 years running that you cannot get a diamond out of anything by hitting it. Webb Coulter kept her books till his hip quit entirely, and then kept them sitting down for another decade. Denny Marsh became, one-armed, the best hay boss in the county, and married one of the Wetstein girls, whose mare he had helped pull out of a coulee in the rain the night everything turned. Diamond lived to be 26 years old. He never carried another rider after her. She saw to that. It was in the deed of the ranch like a covenant, and he ended his days as what he had begun them being. The finest thing the outfit ever raised, dozing under the cottonwoods on the graveyard hill of an afternoon, near Tom, which nobody planned and nobody prevented, and when he died she and Caleb buried him there, on the hill, with the hackamore. And the county thought it excessive, and came to the burying anyway, 200 strong. Hats off. The same size of crowd exactly, Milo Hart noted, that had once hung on a corral fence to watch him kill a washing woman for sport. She lived long enough to see automobiles on the Larkspur Road, and never once waved at one. And she told the story of the 15 minutes only when children asked, and always the same way, sitting on the bench porch with the spring running by, and she always ended it the same place, not the courtroom, not the deed. She ended it on the coldest night of January, 1882, in a lantern-lit kitchen shed with a shaking black colt out of a $10 mare and a big gentle man holding it in his two hands, saying the thing she had spent a lifetime proving. Coal and diamond are the same stuff. The difference is what they've been through and whether anybody troubles to look. Because that was always the whole of it, in the end. A horse the county called a killer, a woman the county called finished, a section of grass a rich man threw on a bet like small change, every one of them written off by people who priced the world at a glance and were wrong at a glance, and every one of them worth a fortune to the first pair of eyes that stayed. The county had needed a courtroom, a blizzard, and 15 minutes by a storekeeper's watch to learn what a Tennessee horse trader's daughter had known standing at that fence in the noise of all that laughter, that what people call worthless is most often just something they haven't learned how to see yet. Dust and diamond. The same stuff, all along. The difference is only what it's been through, and whether anybody in all the laughing crowd ever troubles to look.